Another half day in the Trump administration that's failing. Another preliminary injunction entered by a federal judge. This case, Judge Ali Khan in the District of Columbia, a blocking, at least from now until the end of trial, any efforts by Donald Trump's administration, through the Office of Management or Budget or otherwise, to stop federal funding from going to state organizations and not-for-profits. Billions and billions and billions of dollars were cut off with less than 24 hours' notice. And now Judge Ali Khan has fired back with a scathing new order that I'm going to read to you from and analyze for you here on the Midas Touch Network. Let's start with her conclusions. Towards the back of her order on page 29, I think it sums it up. In order to prove their case that the government, the Trump administration, first issuing an executive order and then a directive or memo from the Office of Management and Budget led by the architect of Project 2025, Russ Vought, then rescinding that memo, which cut off immediately funding to not-for-profits and states, despite the considerable amount of harm and disarray it caused. That led to the temporary restraining order issued by the judge. Now she's looking at a more permanent or preliminary injunction from now till the end of trial. And one of the arguments, the main argument, is that there's been a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act and a violation of the separation of powers, because the executive branch is stepping into the area where Congress has already designated and earmarked this money for funding, and the executive branch is stepping in to stop the funding and impound the funding, which they are not allowed to do. We talk about when governments act arbitrarily and capriciously. That is a term of art. It means they're not doing it with any regard to due process. They're doing it in a way that doesn't pass the rationality test. And here's where the judge came in on page 29. The arbitrary and capricious review at this stage of the litigation remains largely unchanged from the court's earlier opinion. The touchstone of the inquiry is rationality, and defendants' actions, that's Trump and his administration, flunk that test, says Judge Ali Khan. Defendants still cannot provide a reasonable explanation for why they needed to freeze all federal financial assistance in less than a day to, quote, safeguard valuable taxpayer resources. Evaluating funding priorities can be done without the need to starve citizens or deny critical health services, says Judge Ali Khan. The potential $3 trillion in financial assistance implicated by the freeze is breathtakingly large sum of money to suspend practically overnight. And rather than taking a measured approach to identify purported wasteful spending, defendants cut the fuel supply to a vast, complicated nationwide machine, seemingly without consideration for the consequences of that decision. Judge Ali Khan continues, doing so was not and could never be rational, especially when the decision was made without grappling with its catastrophic effects or the logistical nightmare of its implementation, citing to a series of cases. Earlier in the case, the judge continues on page 30, defendants essentially adopted a freeze first and ask questions later approach that entirely fails to consider multiple important aspects of the problem and the reliance of these people on these funds. Earlier in the order, the judge said, in effect, I don't believe the Trump administration when they come here and tell me that they have not they've reopened the spigots of funding, because there were numerous examples that were provided to the judge of, even to this moment, funding not being turned back on. So she when she did her analysis, she looked at, let's talk about when the temporary restraining order was originally filed in the beginning of February. Let's talk about that phase. Let's talk about there's a related case in Rhode Island with Judge McConnell, and he issued his temporary restraining order, and still certain fundings haven't been turned back on even to this day. The best that the Trump administration and a MAGA group that joined along with them in American Center for Law, I always love their titles. Whenever you hear titles like that, you know it's some sort of right-wing, alt-right, MAGA fascist thing. The American Center for Law, trying to defend Donald Trump, The judge didn't buy any of it. She said, first of all, I don't believe you. At one point, you had the memo, the major memo, that was used to cut off funding, which we call M2513 from the Office of Management and Budget. And then, like, after the court filings, you issued M2514, in which in a one-liner, the government said, we rescind M2513. Okay? But Carolyn Levitt, the world's youngest press secretary for Donald Trump, isn't that her title? She got up in front of everybody and she posted in her X posting, this is not a rescission of the federal funding freeze. It's a rescission of the memo. Oh, I see. You're trying to get out from under the court order. Why? And to end any confusion created by the court's injunction. So here's Carolyn Levitt saying out loud in something that the judge recited, which is, I can't believe a word that you people say. You can't get your answer straight when I ask you questions about funding. You can't answer me why certain grants were turned on or off because you don't seem to understand it. And then you try to make a distinction without a difference between the memo interpreting the executive order and the executive order. And I don't believe the press secretary. I mean, that I'm giving you the interpretation from somebody who's done this for 35 years and how you read all these things. So we have that. Then let me just read to you from the other belief of them not, or the other parts where the court has indicated they're not buying a thing that the Trump administration is selling. On page 16 over to 17, it says that rescinding that pause memo did not moot the case because defendants could not and still cannot show that they will not resume the challenged activity, that they won't, when the court's back is turned, that they won't turn off the spigots again. As the court previously observed, the White House press secretary appeared to completely contradict the act of rescission by expressly stating that it's not a rescission of the federal funding freeze. By any reading of the press secretary's remarks, the memorandum's retraction was an empty gesture. At best, it was meaningless. At worst, listen to Judge Ali Khan here, it was a brazen attempt to deprive the court of jurisdiction without actually altering course. The court goes on to say, because plaintiffs' members were still being frozen out of their funding in the wake of the purported rescission, it appears that the Office of Management and Budget sought to overcome a judicially imposed obstacle without ceasing the challenged conduct. In other words, they were violating the court's order while appearing not to do it. That usually pisses off federal judges, and Judge Ali Khan is understandably pissed off and annoyed. The preliminary injunction is now in place. Let me read to you from the conclusion of the preliminary injunction, which will now stay in place all the way through trial, subject to it being taken up on appeal from we're in the District of Columbia, so it would be the D.C. Court of Appeals first. And here's what the court says. Conclusion. The court will enter a preliminary injunction. A separate order will issue. We will get a copy of that order. I'll come back right here on the Midas Touch Network and on Legal AF, and I'll give you the update about it. But the big picture here, is that federal judges who have turned the wheel from administrative stay to temporary restraining order to preliminary injunction are creating amazing records of non-compliance by the Trump administration, and also that they don't believe a word the Department of Justice under Pam Bondi and Donald Trump has to say in their courtroom. They don't trust them, and they're putting everything through a searing analysis, a jaundiced view of the federal court, which bodes terribly for Trump, but is a way to protect our justice system. Next step is the appeal, the inevitable appeal to the D.C. Court of Appeals, where I think Trump will lose again, and then it'll be on the doorstep of the United States Supreme Court. I'll continue to follow it. There's a matching preliminary injunction here, brought by another set of groups, another set of states in Rhode Island, with a Rhode Island federal judge, Judge McConnell. So we got overlapping preliminary injunctions here, which boxes in the government completely. This, again, just to do the math, we're averaging 5 preliminary injunctions or temporary restraining orders a week against the Trump administration. We're averaging 3 lawsuits a day against the Trump administration. And you know where to learn about them all. Midas Touch and Legal AF. I do a show on Tuesdays called Popak Live, where I cover a lot of this material on my own, by myself, unplugged, unfiltered. Popak Live podcast on Tuesday nights, Wednesday and Saturday. Midas Touch, it's Legal AF. We sit at the intersection of law and politics, so you don't have to. Wednesday and Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and wherever you get your podcasts from. And then come on over to Legal AF, the YouTube channel, Legal AF MTN. Help us continue to grow that pro-democracy channel. We're going to hit 500,000 in the next week or two. Help us turn our odometer. You could be the 500,000 person. If whoever's the 500,000 person, I'll throw in a phone call from me to you. All right, to the extent that matters. So in other words, you and I will have a phone call if you're the 500,000th person. We'll try to figure out how we do that. In any event, I'm Michael Popak, and I'm reporting.